Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and we're back today for some more summer scouting as we're going to kind of wrap this up with some strong groups. We're going to be looking at running backs today. Next week, we're going to be looking at defensive tackles, another really strong group in this class. Then we're going to finish it off with quarterbacks and finally some of the stragglers. You know, there's guys I feel like we're kind of missed throughout this that have come on the radar since, names I just missed, and we'll wrap it up there. So we've got right now this video and then probably 3 more planned, and that'll wrap up summer scouting before we really get into the actual draft cycle later on and all that. So with that said, we're going to jump into this. I have got 15 prospects today. There are a lot of names on here, and I will just go ahead and prelude this by saying that the first, at least I'd say 3 guys, are guys that, you know, you're going to know their names most likely. Maybe not the first, but guys I just think are kind of far off right now. They got to have a really good season. They got to prove a lot. These are names that if you're looking for the top people in this class are probably a little bit deeper. So if you want to watch that part, more than welcome to, but I just want to give a heads up. So if you're looking for top guys, you know, probably want to skip the first 3, but nevertheless, we are going to talk about them. I'm trying this year not to delete names the best I can and to keep everyone on, because what happens is I'll look at a guy, I'll not like his film, and then I'll end up deleting him. I'll come back and I'll not like his film again. And so I just do it over and over. But if I have him, I'm like, okay, I've watched this guy before, you know, and I've got something to go off of. But jumping into it, it's a 15th overall guy. Someone I have right now as a 5th round pick is Damien Martinez. Now, before I jump into the whole scouting report here and talk about why I have him so low, because this is a guy I think that people are talking about maybe as like a late day 2 player. Our categories up here on the top right, I want to make sure I elaborate because I forgot to on quite a few of the recent videos and it might be a little confusing. We have size, we have athleticism, BCV is ball carrier vision. So that's all going to be from film evaluation. REC is going to be for receiving. So this is going to be how good they are as a receiver. Blocking, be okay. And then we have physicality. Goes the same for most positions. For running back, you're looking more for, you know, how many yards after contact are these players going to get? You know, how many broken tackles are you going to get? So I try to combine these. I try not to have anything that's like repetitive in here the best I can, because what can happen is I'm kind of counting things twice, because for the most part, I kind of compare grades and kind of equal these things out generally, and then decide at the end, okay, maybe I want to lean towards a guy that has more production or a guy that has more upside. And so maybe I choose the one that has more size and athleticism and that sort of thing. But with that said, hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and jump into this. So Damien Martinez, right now, to me, was just a player that he has potential. He has a really good frame. You know, I gave him an A+ for size, but I question the other parts of his game. I think the athleticism is a little bit lacking. I think that most things are kind of average at best. Now, he is heading to a different situation. You'll see on the picture, this is with Oregon State. He's heading to Miami this year, a team that has got a new quarterback in town that we'll look at soon. They've got a really good offensive line. They've got a lot of talent there, and they might be a top 10 team this season. So I think that's going to be a good situation. And as far as talking about offensive line play, you know, he had a great right tackle in Fuanga, but I think it will be a better situation overall, especially on the interior. But he's got a big, tough frame. He has a lot of potential. This is a guy that has played a lot behind zone blocking specifically. If you're looking for what kind of scheme a player fits, I want to make sure I mention that. So this is more of a zone guy as far as where his experience is. He's someone who does fight hard through contact. And since he's not that fast of a player, he's not really a guy who's going to break away with top speed. He tends to have these more subtle cuts to his game. He's not going to go plant his foot in the ground and completely redirect, because when you're not super athletic, you're going to lose a lot of speed. And there's going to be a guy coming up next that we're going to talk about that with. He has a big issue with that when he's making those sharp cuts. But Martinez is a guy who will make more subtle moves. So He has very smooth footwork, and there are flashes of him being a very aggressive downhill runner, and that physicality grade might go up because of that. But this is kind of where I left it right now, especially because you look at a guy where his blocking grade is an F. We'll get to that in a moment. I think the game against Washington, if you want to watch what the upside is for Martinez, if from 2023, that is the example of what he can be. And what he can be is a strong, physically imposing back that's hard to bring down and has some value as a receiver. But right now, this isn't a guy who was used a ton as a receiver. And this is not a guy I feel like always brings that physicality. There's flashes, but it's not a constant thing. One other thing I want to note before we get into concerns, this is someone who protects the football well. He hasn't had more than a fumble in a season. That can always change, of course, but I do want to give him a shout out there. Now, as far as getting more into concerns here, this guy has a minimal receiving role, and he had multiple drops last year. So that's a concern, but I do think there's upside there. I think he could definitely improve. I think the drops, maybe they're not a huge deal. He also had a quarterback who would be wildly inaccurate at times. And so some of these drops I didn't see might be a result of that. He also is a guy that just does not absorb hits well as a blocker. The first play I watched where he's blocking, he got his ass rocked. Absolutely demolished on the play. There's moments as well as a blocker where it just kind of feels like, I don't want to call him necessarily lazy, but he's just out of position. And there's not the hustle that you want to see. This is the guy, as I mentioned before, the athleticism is an issue, right? Lacks home run speeds, the average athlete at best. His ball carrier vision is mostly average. He makes some questionable decisions. He's not a super creative runner. This is a guy, once again, going back to those cuts, he's not going to be able to make those huge redirections, right? He's not going to make those super sharp cuts because he's going to lose speed, and it's hard with his mass. He's a 230-pound running back. He's a bigger guy. He's also someone that, compared to other running backs, he doesn't break as many tackles. He's tripped up a bit easier. That's a bit of an issue. And when he bounces outside, which he tries to do quite a bit, he doesn't have the speed to get to the edge. He doesn't have the speed to outrun guys. I think he wants to be physical against cornerbacks. Those are better matchups, but he just usually gets swarmed and ends up not having the result he wants. Now, getting into the summary for Martinez. I said he's a physically imposing back with an impressive build. He fights hard through contact, lowers his shoulder into defenders, and extends runs. His game against Washington was a flash of what he could be, which is a bruiser with receiving ability that can lead a backfield. Given his size, he doesn't go for sharp cuts or instant change of direction, but rather opts for subtle moves and fakes to extend plays. Unfortunately, he doesn't come anywhere near the top speed to be a home run threat, as he's an average athlete. He also lacks creativity, running into contact too often and missing cuts. For how physical of a runner he is, Martinez goes down early because of poor contact balance. As a receiver, he's been limited, he's had some drop issues flare up, and I do want to note, at least, like I said before, these could be a result of poor quarterback play, which is why this new situation might be better for him with Miami. Now, he's also got Cam Ward, who I haven't scouted yet, but I know that he's not exactly a super refined prospect. That's at least what I've heard so far. We'll see when I watch it. But it is something to note. As a blocker, Martinez is big, but he gets rocked. He's not anticipating what's coming often enough. He's not in position. I do think that for him to set himself apart, like all these other guys, he has to find special traits about himself. That is what's going to make you someone that an NFL team is going to game plan for. And I do think with this situation in Miami, this is a guy who could go prove it this year. And then all of a sudden he goes from 5th round guy to, now he's going to be a good player at the next level. You've got players every year that do this, right? Quinshon Mitchell was not a 1st round prospect last year heading into the season. He played his ass off. He proved himself at every point. And that guy was, I didn't put him down as a blue chip prospect. If I could go back now, I would consider him a blue chip prospect. Hell of a football player, right? And Martinez is one of those guys who maybe he can go out this season and prove he's a physically imposing power back for a team, and he's got upside in the receiving game. He can clean up his blocking. Maybe he can be an all-around guy. But right now, he's not. That's an important thing to me as well, as far as talking about what's the limit for how high you can go. You need to be able to do a lot, because you don't want to take guys who are not on the field almost all the time before a certain point in the draft, ideally. Or you get a Zach Charbonnet kind of pick, where you take him in the second round and he's not really seeing the field a ton. So, no, try not to destroy the Seahawks there or anything, but just a thought. My pro comp for him, this was Ramondre Stevenson. It's an upside comp, of course, right? Stevenson, by the way, well, he just got extended. Well, he's had a really good NFL career. He was not a guy that went out in like the first round. You know, he was someone who ended up proving himself in the NFL. But I think this is what Martinez can be like if he can prove himself as a blocker and as a receiver. Both these guys where people have great size, they play with adequate strength and have smooth movement. But both of them kind of lack twitch. They're not super explosive. They're generally average athletes without breakaway speed. Both these guys as well, coming out of college, not super creative runners, but they were very patient in the way they played. And so that could be good behind an offensive line that can block for you, an offensive line that can open up those holes and maybe just needs the time. The big difference right now, and I kind of mentioned this already, is that Stevenson, when he came out, he was a good blocker and a reliable receiver at the time of declaring, which is why I think he went a little bit earlier than what this projection was. It was like third or fourth round. But right now, I have him as a D, Damien Martinez, that is. And the way the grading scale works, just to go over that again quick, we have S tier. That's blue chip prospects, top of the first round. A is for first round guys. B is for second round. And then your pluses and minuses are like early, late, nothing means middle. C is going to be third. D plus is fourth. D is fifth. And D minus is like sixth through seventh. So that's what the grading scale is. Games I watched for Damien Martinez were San Diego State, UCLA, and Washington, all coming from the 2023 football season. Now, given we have 15 prospects here and we're 12 minutes into this already, I'm going to try to speed up some of these a little bit. But our next guy, Raheim Sanders, or some people know him as Rocket Sanders. He's a guy that when people look at him, you see some flashes at points, right? And the flashes are really exciting. And I've even heard him get compared to Derrick Henry at points. And I think like, I'm not comparing him to Derrick Henry. I'll make that clear first of all. But it's when he's being his best as a physical back, he will, in the same way Henry does on the field, just grab a guy and throw him like he's a little kid. He will just do that. He will look like he is playing with small children on the field at times. And that's, I think, where that upside comes, or that excitement comes. But this is a player who has a lot to prove this season. He has a lot on the line, because right now, well, he could be a starter in the NFL and be a productive player. He's a guy that has been injured a lot. He's a guy that's not been on the field all the time. He's a guy that has questionable traits that really limit him. And it would be very difficult for me to actually sit here and say the comp is Derrick Henry. So this is a guy, just getting into my notes on him. He has a lot of experience behind zone blocking. He's a strong blocker as well. He has great top end speed. That is the one really good athletic trait. Usually that gets you a great grade, but the problem is that there's a lot of other areas that are lacking. And so he can burn a defense. He can do that. He has a lot of patience as a runner. Not always a great thing, right? But if you have a little bit, that's good too, because sometimes you got to wait for the right opportunity. You got to be smart. You got to be decisive, but you got to have a good balance. And so he's a very patient runner. He's tough to bring down when he's on his game. Like I said, he gets some comparisons to Derrick Henry in those moments. You can see it on film. You can see on the highlights. You go watch him, but that's really where it stops. There are flashes of dominance from Raheim Sanders, and all this stuff really comes from 2022. There's even some athletic upside there. You will actually see where he can like stick his foot into the ground and completely redirect, and he looks elusive on the field for a 225-pound, 6'2" back. That's good, right? But it's not what he always is. And so he has to prove this year that he can be that. The concerns, getting into that, he has not carried a big load as a receiver. So volume could increase there. He runs into contact way too often. He's not a super creative or impressive runner with vision. He's also at the same time not necessarily a super big liability. That's why he gets a C minus, just maybe a little bit below average. Now, one thing I've noticed is that when he's moving downfield and he's trying to juke a guy, he will sort of just stop moving towards the end zone and he starts moving laterally. Like he just loses all of his speed and all of his momentum. And that's not good. You don't want to see that, because that's just, you might get that one guy, maybe, but you're going to have 4 on your tail now because you just slowed down for him. So he loses a lot of speed doing that. He's not a guy who consistently changes directions without coming to a near stop. And so that's like where we saw some upside in 2022, where he can plant his foot. He can change directions and keep most of his speed. But that's not really what he did in 2023, and he's got to prove that he can do that again. It's also a guy who goes down when his legs get pretty much any contact, for the most part. You know, if it's not just a brushing, usually he's going down. He does not have great contact balance. He's a guy who fumbles a lot. He doesn't have suddenness. He feels very stiff as a player. And that explosive element, while he has that speed, he's pretty much just got to be in open space to get to that. And so not really super explosive aside from that part. And the biggest issue, of course, injuries clouding his projection. I think it impacts more than just simply the athleticism, but it's also about production. It's about proving that you're going to be healthy at the next level and you can take a big workload. Now, getting into my summary for him, I say he's a larger back with scary top end speed that can threaten the defense. He's a patient runner, waiting for lanes to open and relying upon his size to stay upright through contact. In his best moments, Sanders will be compared to Derrick Henry, as he'll throw defenders off him as if he's playing with kids. Unfortunately, this isn't what Sanders is in most other plays. Sanders struggles athletically, losing speed when making deeper cuts and lacking contact balance to survive hits below his waist. He isn't a sudden runner, appearing stiff and relying on strength alone. Sanders also struggled with fumbles the last few years, a trait that can get you benched at the next level. There were moments before his injuries last season when Sanders would show some elusiveness, but it's not a certainty to show up more often. Sanders has questionable vision, running into contact and not being a creative runner. While he's proven reliable when he's been used in the receiving game, his experience there doesn't stand out. With all of these concerns, it still has to be said that he has potential. He's been hampered by injuries and should be heading to a good squad in South Carolina. If he can get back to his game and establish himself as an all-around physical runner with breakaway speed, he could get into the day 2 mix. So I should know, I didn't say at the start, he is transferring. He's not going to be with Arkansas this year. He's going to South Carolina. That's a better team. Don't know about the offensive line situation as much, but I do know South Carolina is a better team. And so that's good for him. He's going to be yet another huge physically imposing player for South Carolina. It seems like they love those guys. My comp here will probably be the wildest comp I use in all of these videos. Not wild because the comparison's necessarily bad, but just a player that I have barely watched. A player that was probably starting most of his football career when I was born. But I went with Ronnie Wingo Jr. I found this trying to look around for who he was being compared to. And this is a former Arkansas running back. So coming from the same school, but they're both guys that play with like a super physical, upright style of play. You know, Raheim Sanders, not a guy with a low center of gravity, probably another concern you could throw in. Both these prospects had great top end speed, though. Athletic limitations elsewhere, but great top end speed. The big concerns mainly came around their ability to cut without losing speed. And both prospects as well. Something that was similar was they had limited receiving roles. They were limited, though. They weren't necessarily liabilities. So guys who just didn't get too much of a chance there. But that's the comp I went with. It's kind of a weak one because I haven't watched the player a ton, but I watched a little bit and I thought it was probably the best one I was going to get. And, as far as comps go, I just want to say this really quick. These are not 100%, right? And I've said that before. The reason why I'm throwing these in and why I have them on my summaries for these players is because what's going to happen eventually, and just complete honesty, is that a month or two from now, when I come back to a player, I'm going to forget a lot of things about that player. And I feel like my notes will be good on him, but I want to have something that will remind me of what this player was like. So if I can see a name, I think that helps out a lot. I think that's a good tool to have, but you got to understand all these players are their own individuals. They're different. They're not the same as these guys. I try to note those differences. You guys will have access to all this stuff soon. Once I'm finished, I've got all these prospects in, I'll be sharing the draft board. So you guys can check that out, see all this information, but just want to kind of explain that. Now, for the grade, he's another 5th round guy to me. He can move up into day 2, but right now, not really even a priority 3rd day pick. I'd be fine if a team spent it there, but I think you could get different players at that point and kind of wait a little bit just with how his career's gone and the questions. And he's going to be an older back as well who's been injured, taken a lot of hits. But the film I watched here, I had South Carolina and Ole Miss from 2022. Then I watched one game from 2023, was a limited season for him. He got injured, and that was Ole Miss again. So 2 games against Ole Miss, 1 against his new team in South Carolina. Now, getting into what I believe is our last day 3 guy here. It's DJ Giddens out of Kansas State. This was someone I thought I was really going to like. And he just kind of looks like he could be a starting running back at the next level. He has that appearance. He has that really nice, 6-foot frame roughly. He's probably not 6'1", but we list what the colleges give us, and we'll wait until the combine to be told he's an inch shorter and not as heavy, which happens with basically every prospect. But DJ Giddens was someone that I felt like he could do everything, but he wasn't necessarily going to do everything at a high level. He's a very good receiver. I will give him that. That is an area where he is very strong, but I just think there's a lot of improvement that he can make overall. Now, really quick, I'm going to get a sip of water and we'll jump into this. So, DJ Giddens. My positives for him, just to note his scheme primarily, he runs mostly behind gap blocking. And what this has done for him is this has allowed him to be a very patient runner. He's often getting behind blockers, and so he's not really going full speed. He's using a lot of tempo. He's setting up his moves. He's thinking it out. He's a guy that takes a bit of time to process what he's going to do next. Now, talking about the receiving ability, this is the best thing about him. It is natural. He is a natural receiver. He has very good volume there. He shows he's capable. And I found that he had a varied route tree. They asked him to do a lot of different things. He did them at a high level. So that's really nice to see, especially for a guy who I think was a sophomore last year, or it was his 2nd year of starting, I believe. So he's a player that's already very good in that role and could be a really nice complementary piece because you can come out, you can catch the ball for us, you can be that guy who's maybe the 3rd down back, and then, if we have an injury, all of a sudden, you can start. You're not necessarily great at everything, but you're good enough to start. So I like him for that kind of role. Talking about getting back to like rushing here, this is a guy who can plant his foot and make really sharp cuts. Not all the time, but he can do it. The only thing I'll note with it that's negative is it's a very elongated motion. It is not super quick. He's not as explosive as other players. He's also a player, though, that does have really good lateral agility. When he makes those cuts, it works really well. It's his go-to move as well. And this is a guy that, well, he's not physically imposing. He has a poor grade there for the most part. He will elude a tackle pretty much every play. He'll make the first guy miss. He has that Madden trait to his game. He does have good burst, although not explosive. And as a talking about ball carrier vision here, he usually makes sound decisions. He's not a guy who's really going to make the wrong decisions necessarily, but it's more so in the sense that he might not make the decision quick enough and he gets tackled, or just kind of runs into the wrong place because he didn't choose what to do quick enough. He does have above average contact balance, something to note here. And as a blocker, and kind of going back to this all-around game, he's decent. You know, he's not a guy I look at and say he's a liability. He can't do this. Like, he's capable. Now the concerns here, what does DJ Giddens need to do to improve his game? I think he needs to add muscle mass. That's the first thing. He's not a guy who's going to power through contact really well. He's going to be very limited there. This is not a guy I want running up the middle when we're up against a good defensive line. That's not ideal for him. He's 212. I think he could get up around 220, get close to the size of some of these top prospects, like a Quinshon Judkins, or I don't know if TreVeyon Henderson's there. I think Hampton's pretty close. But Judkins would be an example of where he could get as far as size. He also is someone that can clean up some drops from last year. Now, given he has a bigger receiving role, that's going to happen. But I do think that's an area where he needs to improve. He also has questionable top speed. He's not a guy who's going to break away, not a guy who's going to blow the top off the defense. He's not a twitched-up athlete. There are times where, going back to the processing, usually he doesn't process quick enough if it's an issue. But there's also times where he just panics and makes the wrong choice. And so I'd just like to see him be smarter in this regard. I think this is the big area where he can improve, because then you're talking about a guy that has good ball carrier vision. He's good all around. He's going to make the right moves and just needs to put on a little bit of size. And all of a sudden you're talking about a guy who's probably a starting back in the NFL. And then the final thing, which we've alluded to already, limited physical presence. Not something that stands out. Not something you're going to note. It was hard for me to get a grade down for this because you just didn't see many examples of it. If you saw anything, it was him getting rocked. And so definitely want to see that improve. Now, getting into the summary with him, he's a lengthy back with strength in the receiving game. He's natural, running a variety of routes, has handled a large workload in recent years. As a rusher, he thrives in gap schemes where he can follow blockers through the second level and have time to anticipate his moves. He plays with good tempo, varying speed, and setting up his moves. Giddens' go-to move is his lateral cut, planting his foot in the ground, changing directions. Despite lacking ideal strength, he's elusive, and he often forces at least one defender to miss. While he's elusive, Giddens does have questionable athleticism, as he lacks twitch and doesn't have great top-end speed. In addition, Giddens lacks a physical element to his game, rarely laying a big hit and simply looking to bounce off defenders. When the game's moving fast, Giddens struggles to make choices, either getting stuffed for a loss or cutting in the wrong direction. He has a refined game, but he needs to stand out in more than his receiving abilities to be a top prospect. Above all, I'd like to see him become more of a physical presence on the field and improve his mental processing. If he takes that next step, Giddens could start to warrant conversations about being an ideal starter at the next level. So my comp here was Zach Charbonnet. So a guy brought into Seattle, I already mentioned him in this video technically, but he was brought in mainly as a receiving threat. He was going to add on there because Walker was not a guy who had a big volume in the receiving game. And so that was what Charbonnet was coming in for. And then maybe he was going to be the replacement people thought. Didn't really happen, right? Walker's a great player. But this is kind of an upside comp almost because, talking about a difference, Charbonnet is a more physical runner, right? That is a big thing here. But I don't think they're super far off in other ways. They're both patient runners, guys who wait for blocks to develop. They consistently break tackles as well. They're both prospects with a variety of routes. They have good frames to haul in targets. They're very gifted in the receiving game, but they struggle with athletic limitations and indecisiveness at times. And then one thing in favor of Giddens is I do think he has more lateral agility than Charbonnet does. So my grade here, this is a 4th round pick to me at this point. I don't know how early necessarily in the 4th round, but I think if you need a running back at that point, especially someone to help in the receiving game, this is a nice time to take Giddens. I just don't see that the dominant elements from him that put him in the day 2 consideration yet. So that's my grade right now. That can definitely change. We got a whole year, but the games I watched all from 2023, watched UCF, Kansas, and North Carolina State. So now getting into a guy that I believe was on the cover of College Football 25, I've got Donovan Edwards here. And this is getting into day 2 finally. 12 guys that I've got here. A lot of good running backs in this class. This is going to be one of the best classes we're going to see, right? And the reason why is you have the really good players on top and you have the depth, right? I don't think it's to the level of maybe the Bijan Robinson class. Like, I think Robinson was a far better player than any of these guys. But there's people at the top, I think, that can prove that they're worth it. That can prove that they might be a middle of the 1st round guy. And then that blue chip talent is there. Well, while he might not have that grade for me, there's a limitation, of course, to running back. You don't want to be the team that picks one in the top 10. You know, it shocked me that the Lions were even going to pick Jahmyr Gibbs at number 6 overall, which is apparently what we heard. But setting that aside, getting into Donovan Edwards. For me, he's a guy that he needs to prove he can start and take the full-time load. And to be fair, he played with Blake Corum, so didn't really help there. But he's got to prove that. He's got to start to be more than average at some things. I just found in general that, you know, aside from athleticism, most things he's just kind of like a little bit above average. So positives, I think he's a tad shorter than listed, and that's actually a good thing. Like, for me, if I'm looking for size for running backs, you can get all different kinds, right? You can have different thing you want, and that changes what you're looking for. But I think he's probably closer to 6 foot, and I like to get guys around maybe 5'11" or within an inch of that. I think that's a good size here. So it's a good thing that he's probably not that height. He has good top speed as well. Not great, though. And changes directions really well without losing much speed. So it's a guy who's going to keep his momentum going. He runs with a low center of gravity. He has a really fun run style. If you go watch him, he looks like he's just lunging down the field, like super low to the ground, but he's a fun guy to watch in that regard. Now, this helps him absorb hits. One thing I want to note about that, he's also a guy who hasn't fumbled since 2022. He has huge strides. When he's coming down the field, he looks like a bowling ball. That's the best description I can give of it. He's dangerous in open space. He also has some good moments as a blocker. Now, he wasn't dominant there all the time. That's why he gets this average grade from me. But there were definitely the moments to tell you there's more that Edwards can be here. He's also a tough player. I watched one of his games where he played through injury in 2022. Given it was a hand injury, that makes it pretty hard to play, right? Because you got to protect the ball. And so I think it says something when you don't sit just because you got the injury and you go help your team try to play and try to win. So that was something I appreciate from him. He's also a guy who makes sure to fall forward for extra yardage. And this year is a year where he gets that opportunity to be a starter again. 2022 was where he probably got his most time on the field. I think it was because Corum got injured at one point. So you saw some bigger games. That was a year I had to watch on film because it's kind of hard to find him otherwise. He's just sort of a rotational guy right now. And part of the reason why he's not a super high pick at this point. He is also a guy that is kind of scheme independent. He has a lot of experience in both zone and gap. He keeps his legs moving. He's always churning forward for extra yards. And as a receiving back, he's a solid route tree. There's more upside there as well. I think he's got something to work with. He's above average, and he's going to get better at that. Now, getting into concerns, the big thing, of course, compared to these other guys, he's not someone who's been the lead guy in the backfield by himself. It hasn't happened. We'll see if that happens this year. It's an opportunity for it with Blake Corum going to the draft, but Michigan's a good school. You know, they're going to have a lot of good players there. He also has some questionable choices at times on choosing where he's going to run, which kind of limits his grade here. And a lot of his highlight runs, like the best plays from him, weren't super impressive because they were a result of really poor defense. Like, he would literally just get the ball and run straight forward, and there would be no one in the secondary. They'd all bail towards the quarterback, and he'd just run in for a touchdown. And it happened like 3 or 4 times on film. And that was like every big play. So it kind of sucks because like that should be good, but it's not really him doing that, right? Unless you think he faked out 11 defenders. I don't think he did. He's also someone getting back to blocking here. While he has those good moments, he doesn't really line his blocks up super well, and he doesn't have the ideal size to hold up. You know, I think if you want to be a good blocker, probably want to get closer, maybe 220. He is a kind of smaller back. You know, all your backs are, of course, pretty muscular, but in regards to other guys, I think he's got a little bit to do there. He also had a few drops in 2023 with a pretty light receiving role, so that's a bit of a concern. And as far as contact balance, when he's not at full speed, when he's going slower, you see some moments where he just isn't really able to stay upright. Now, getting into my summary for Donovan Edwards, I say he's a hard-nosed runner with the potential to establish himself as a clear starter at the next level. He's a plus athlete, having good overall speed and change of direction ability. When running downhill, Edwards takes big strides and lowers his center of gravity, which helps him stay balanced and absorb hits. Some traits that I love about his game. He's also tough and physical, played through injury in 2022, and consistently fought for extra yards on film. While he can grow as a blocker, he had some nice moments on film that could serve as a baseline to work with. In the receiving game, Edwards runs a nice variety of routes, but ultimately hasn't had a major role. In 2024, he needs to prove that he can be a full-time starter after taking snaps behind Blake Corum for a few years. While he had some breakaways that would indicate good ball carrier vision, I find this is an area of weakness in his game, as he would often run straight into his line before finding the gap. Edwards could also look to clean up some drops from last season to establish himself as a receiving threat. There isn't a major flaw that limits Edwards from being an all-around back, but he must prove he can be more than proficient and handle a large workload to warrant consideration before day 3. So I'm kind of putting him maybe a little bit earlier where he would go right now for me, because I do think he's going to have a good year. But he's got to go prove that, of course. You're going to see that with some prospects on here where I'm going to rank him. You know, I have some expectations for some of these guys, but Edwards is probably the first of those, even sitting here at 12. I gave him, once again, middle of the 3rd round grade. Games I watched for him is Penn State in 2022, Ohio State in 2022, Washington 2023. And my comp for him, I went with Kenyon Drake. So the reason why, similar builds, guys with long frames, average mass, and both prospects who were kind of all-around backs. Weren't elite in any aspect, but just kind of generally good at everything. There were also guys, though, that one of their weaknesses was making poor decisions on where to run. They weren't able to get, let me correct that. They were able to get yardage, though, after, because they kept churning forward. So these were guys who at least were physical and were able to get extra yards because of that, but they need to improve their processing skills. So that's who I went with for Donovan Edwards. Now, getting into our final guy outside of the top 10, someone who might also be a really good return man. Shout out to NFL Stock Exchange for throwing that out there. But Jaydn Ott. So, getting into him, it's another middle of the 3rd round guy for me. Someone who's very athletic. That is where his specialty is going to lie as a player. He has good athleticism. He has great acceleration. When the hole opens up, he's a guy who instantly reaches that speed, that top speed, and in an instant, he's just gone. He has legit home run ability. He's a guy who gets skinny between blocks. He has strong hands in the receiving game. He's a patient runner, but on top of being patient, He has the decisiveness to go when the lane opens. Not a guy who waits when the opportunity's there. He does also, going back to talking about return man, he has some upside there. He could be a returner for a team. I believe the statistic I heard is he's had 3 returns in college, and one of them he returned for a touchdown. And you see that speed and that decision making on film that could absolutely prove that. He's also a guy that brings effort as a blocker. He's a guy who wants to be the aggressor. Now, of course, you look at my grade, wasn't the best results, so we'll get to that in a moment. He's also a guy who has very impressive lateral agility. He can move very smoothly from side to side, and he has a lot of experience specifically in gap schemes. Now, getting into concerns here, this is a slender running back. Compared to other backs in this class, he does not look the same size. I'm not 100% convinced that he is 210. I'm sure by the time of the draft, he'll probably get up to that, but he looked a bit smaller in 2023. Now, other things about him, he did have a few fumbles last year, so that's a statistic he's going to have to clean up because, like we said earlier, if you're fumbling the ball too often, you're going to get benched. Doesn't matter what you do outside of that, they just can't put you on the field because you can turn a game on its head for the opponent. He's also a guy that, reason why we don't have higher than a B on ball carrier vision, he can be indecisive when that lane does not present itself early. He will get stuffed. So very patient, but if that lane's not there, he just kind of sits there and he gets tackled. So sometimes, if he's not getting tackled even, he'll bounce back. He'll lose more yards. So not good results. He also lacks power in his game, which is kind of goes without saying. If he's listed as 210, I'm not even sure he's up to that. Usually not going to be a physical guy. But he is a slender build, and he doesn't really lower the shoulder as well going into contact, so that does not help him being more upright when you're engaging with guys. And as far as the blocks go, well, he is a guy who wants to be the aggressor. He doesn't line them up very well. So that's the big issue there as far as blocks. Now, getting into my summary on him, I say he's a quick, slender running back with home run ability. He often plays with decisiveness, shooting for open lanes and reaching top speed in an instant. He demonstrated his home run ability multiple times on film and may have some upside as a return man. He has great lateral agility, shifting around when running between the tackles and picking up extra yardage. As a blocker, he has good effort on film, but ultimately is too slender to be consistent. He also has he's been reliable in the receiving game, although in a limited role. The biggest concern I have is the power aspect of his game. He's slender compared to most backs and may be lighter than listed. He plays upright and he doesn't lower his shoulder that often. On plays where Ott doesn't have an open lane, he becomes indecisive and loses yardage. He profiles as a speed element of a running back committee and could command a starting role, but that has limited value in the draft. So that's why I went with middle of the third round. My comp for him was Chuba Hubbard. Now, the comp here, the reason why these were guys that were long, lighter players, but they had that explosive speed and that really good lateral quickness. But ultimately, there are also guys that kind of struggled when there wasn't an open lane. They didn't make the decisive decisions when there was the opportunity in front of them, or when there wasn't, that is. And there were also guys who often lost yards in the situations, either sitting there behind the line of scrimmage or bouncing back and being in an even worse situation. The games I watched for Jaydn Ott were North Texas, USC, and Stanford from the 2023 season. So, with that said, it's time to get into the top 10 here. So, we got a Rutgers guy. We got Kyle Monangai. So, this one kind of took me a minute to figure out until I heard the comp listening to one of my favorite podcasts, and made a lot of sense, specifically, and just kind of like the way they shift around on the field. But we'll get into that comp. You can see it on screen. I'll talk about it at the very end. But Monangai is a guy who's really well filled out for a shorter back. Now, 210 is usually not incredible size, but he's 5'9". So good size in that regard. This guy is physical. Super freaking physical. He is a zone guy, talking about the scheme he runs behind, and he does not fumble. Just simply does not do that. Maybe that changes this year, but you just don't find it on film. He is also a guy who, while he's super physical, he gets the full speed quick. He's a smooth mover. He makes these small little cuts to elude defenders. Not someone who's going to always plant his foot in the ground, redirect, but he knows how to manage his speed as someone who's not the most explosive of players. Still got a little bit there, but he knows how to keep that speed. And so he makes these little cuts and these fakes to elude defenders in open space. He is an adequate blocker, but he is also a guy who's super physical as a blocker. He gets his job done. He's used there a lot. There's a lot of upside at the end of the day. He wants to kill people in that role. Now, he's also someone who, talking about contact balance, is very good contact balance. He's got a little bit of burst as well. He can evade tacklers in close quarters. He can stay upright. And he's not afraid to make that contact with someone. Doesn't look for it necessarily. You know, you don't want to try to get into traffic, but he will do it if he has to. And he'll get physical. He'll maul defenders. He's not afraid to do any of that stuff. Now, getting into concerns with him, there's virtually no time spent here in a receiving role. Still had a drop, given that. But maybe upside is there. Someone who has a lot to prove there. I gave him an F just because he does not really line up in those situations often, and you drop one of the passes. He also struggles to line up his blocks at times, especially when on the move, which is what kind of limits the blocking grade, but when he does get them lined up, it's a really good result most of the time. He's also another guy who's kind of indecisive when the lane's not there. And one of my reasons why I didn't put him higher in the middle of the third round was because I wasn't sure that he can be a dominant game-changing back, and that limits his ceiling. So if he can change that, he could go higher in the draft. If a team really wants another guy in their committee, maybe he goes higher too. But that's one of those questions. And then the final thing I wrote was, how good is his top speed? I don't know if he's a guy who's going to blow the top off a defense. He'll get up to speed quick. He'll accelerate pretty well. But that top speed isn't fully there. So my summary on him, I say he's a tough running back with surprising physicality. He's not afraid to lay out defenders, laying the shoulder, and powering forward through contact. He's a good athlete, getting to his top speed quickly and maintaining it through cuts. While his cuts are rarely decisive or sharp, the speed he combines makes it difficult for defenders to tackle him. He absorbs hits well, maintaining his balance and extending the play, and he never fumbles. As a blocker, Monangai wants to kill blitzers, squaring up with more power than expected and holding his own. At times he's out of position though, or struggles to place his own blocks on the move, but I'd still consider this a positive. In the receiving game, there's not much that really stands out as an issue on his part, but the volume just doesn't exist. If he can get more involved in the receiving game, he could be considered an all-around back, and that could really change this projection for him a bit too. Finally, I found that he can be indecisive at times, sitting around the line of scrimmage and getting hit in the backfield. He is a guy who has the upside to start in the NFL for a while, but the question is whether or not he'll be an impact player as a rusher. So I specifically said rusher because I think he could be an impact player as a blocker. There's areas where he could be really strong for a team, but that's the big question. Now, the comp here, I went with Blake Corum, and just to get back to that for a moment, these were short, muscular runners. Guys who played with an immense amount of physicality, and they were both guys who had great contact balance, able to stay upright. They were able to take on multiple hits and absorb them. And then the big thing I alluded to before was that these are guys who, when you're talking about how they avoid defenders in the open field, they're making those subtle cuts. They're not going to make the huge redirection, but they're going to try to maintain that speed because they don't have the elite top speed, and that's how they're going to try to win. They often succeed doing that. So I think he's a safe player. Monangai is. We'll see how high you can go in the draft, but I don't think he's, in the top of this class, but definitely someone that could be a good prospect on day 2. Now, my film reviewed for him, just to wrap this up, is Wisconsin, Penn State, and Michigan State, all from 2023. Now, getting into our last third round guy that we've got, now we're going to move up into the second. So I've got right now 8 guys as first and second round prospects, 6 of them being second. Now, here's a guy you might know, Trevor Etienne. Yes, he's familiar with Travis. They're brothers. I'm sure every person on the planet knew that, to be fair. But Trevor Etienne, he's a short runner, but he's got a very stout build. He's got great acceleration, that high level burst, and he's a true home run guy. He has that kind of speed. He also, in the receiving game, appears to have very good hands and a varied route tree. He has some great moments there. I just think he needs a bigger role, and he might end up getting that at Georgia with his transfer. He's also a guy who hasn't had a drop or even an incomplete pass thrown his way his entire college career. Now, that'll probably change this year. That's quite a crazy statistic, but it says a lot about what's there, right? This is a reliable guy in the receiving elements of the game. He just needs another shot there. He's also someone that he has a ton of experience behind zone blocking, but his best plays, and a lot of what I saw early on in film, it was following these blockers and gap schemes. It was getting behind guys, letting the play develop, and making his run from there. He's a player who uses a lot of tempo. He is not just full speed all the time. He is going to vary his speed to try to make people miss. He does a really good job with that. He has a lot of patience as a runner. He lets things develop. He follows blockers. That's where you want him to be. He also has great lateral quickness. He can make guys miss in a phone booth. You're going to hear that phrase a few times probably to wrap up for the rest of these prospects, which we're technically not even halfway done. We're getting close, though. Also a guy who brings a lot of effort as a blocker, but ultimately unrefined, which is why he doesn't get a great grade there. He does have great contact balance. He also lowers his shoulder in the contact. And so a lot of these things, like, it helps when you're smaller with the contact balance. It's something to note here. And he's relatively good as well at protecting the football. Last positive I wrote there, not a ton of fumbles. I think it was like 1 in each of his seasons so far. And he's had a pretty decent role, so you can live with that. Now, getting into concerns, limited time as a receiver kind of limits how high I can go with the grade, but really just says he needs more of an opportunity. He's also a guy that, well, he's played a lot behind zone. There's those questions about if that's going to be the best situation for him. So it kind of depends. Like, some teams may have a guy run more gap while another guy runs more zone. So it depends on what you want. But I think he's a guy that's probably going to be his best when guys are getting on the move and when they're getting lined up with specific people and he's got someone to follow. His ball carrier vision as well, it does depend heavily on the type of scheme he has. So the grades I would have gone with, if I was going scheme dependent, I would have given him an A. In gap blocking, I would have given him probably a C in zone, which is why he falls right in the middle. He's also someone that, given his size, and especially being 205, he doesn't have the power to drive through the middle through defenders. He's not someone you're going to trust in those situations just because the physical ability might not be there. And then finally, as a blocker, has very limited experience compared to other players. So my summary on Trevor Etienne, I said that he's a short, explosive back with untapped potential in the receiving game. He has instant acceleration and often caught defenders off guard with his speed. As a receiver, he has limited experience, but he ran a variety of routes and showcased soft hands on film. Given his success in such a limited role, I think there's much to work with. In the running game, he has great moments behind gap schemes where he can follow blockers and get creative in space. He utilizes tempo to keep his defenders guessing where to make the tackle. He has impressive lateral quickness, making defenders miss in close quarters, and he has strong contact balance. The concerns are mainly based on the limitations of what smaller backs can do. He's not a good blocker despite effort and could be considered a liability at times. He also needs to make better decisions, especially behind zone blocking, as he can get indecisive and lacks the power to run through heavy contact. As mentioned, Etienne has plenty of upside as a receiver, but he needs to get more reps in that role. There's a lot of upside here, especially with the transfer to Georgia, which is a top 10 run blocking unit in college football as of last season. And they've got some good players there. We've talked about guys in the past, but these Georgia and Alabama teams specifically, you can always rely on the offensive line from them. So good situation for Etienne. Say that as a Florida fan, it's going to be better for him there. I almost, as a Florida fan, at times would basically give guys like a whole nother round earlier. I would take them when they leave because I think it's just that much better. I don't actually do that, but I'm tempted at points because I don't know. Like every time I watch Florida, it's like pain. That team is just dead. But someday it'll change. So pro comp here for Trevor Etienne. The one I had actually heard elsewhere was Chase Edmonds. So I did a little bit of research into this. I found it was a pretty good one. Identical size for these guys. They're short, stout guys that feature a lot of power in their lower halves. They're both prospects who have really good flexibility. They have explosiveness, and it allows them to blow through gaps and get dangerous in open space. They're also both prospects that have the athletic upside to succeed as receivers and just simply need to gain more experience in that role coming into the NFL. And the final thing I wrote here was that they both struggle to be good blockers, given their size. Now, my grade for Etienne, early third round right now, could go higher with a better situation. We'll see how it goes there, but definitely has a shot to move up the board this year. So film watch to wrap him up: Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri, all from the 2023 season. So a lot of SEC opponents in there. Now getting to our next guy, and I'll talk a little bit Jaguars specific here for a moment. Tahj Brooks. If the Jaguars leave the 2024 season saying, man, we really sucked running the ball up the middle, if they do that again, this is the guy you draft. If it's Tank Bigsby's fault, I'll make that clear too, because last year, while Tank Bigsby didn't have a good year, the offensive line between the tackles was I know the whole offensive line was 31st run blocking per PFF and per my eyes, but I think it was probably 32nd without the tackles, because the tackles were the best of everyone at run blocking, and that was still below par. So that's a bigger problem, of course, to me. But if Bigsby isn't working out, Brooks is the guy. This is a name to keep your eyes on. Would be a phenomenal fit, and you'll love the pro comp at the bottom, who I'll talk about. Not exactly the same, but I just kind of want to work from that base there. So getting into Tahj Brooks, big muscular guy. One of my guys in this class right now heading into the season. He's got solid height, and he has balanced experience behind zone and gap schemes. He moves really well for how filled out he is. This is a 230-pound guy, and he is a freaking monster. He has really good acceleration, good change of direction ability. When he is going to get into contact, he will lower that shoulder, and he will embrace it. He will look to kill people. He'll bulldoze defenders when running up the middle, and he's broken a lot of tackles in his time. He's pretty damn good at it. He's got good hands as well. Only has one drop over his career. Obviously, given the grade, it's about getting the opportunity there. So not a guy who's been used heavily as a receiver. He also, for these big guys, they're usually just run up the middle, get us the hard yards, get us the 3rd and 1 situation, perhaps, or 3rd and 2. A lot of those guys usually aren't very creative. Tahj Brooks has some creativity. He is not just the guy who runs straight up the middle. He's got a little bit of ball carrier vision to him, which I love. One of the things that's really exciting about him. He also has very good contact balance, lower center of gravity, 5'10", probably a little bit shorter even. And he will break away consistently from what looks like on screen to be a surefire tackle. Now, getting into concerns here, doesn't have that breakaway speed. He's 230 pounds. That's not what you're drafting this guy for. He also, once again, has pretty much non-existent production as a receiver, despite a healthy dose of targets. So actually, I want to get into that for a moment and clarify what I was saying before. He gets targets, right? But the passes are just stupid, honestly. They'll throw the ball to him, when he's 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage and a guy is standing like 2 feet away from him. And he'll go up to grab it and he'll just get trucked immediately because he doesn't have time to go kill the guy, right? Like he's in midair catching the ball. And so you just saw all these plays like where he's supposed to be going out on a screen and he's covered and they throw to him anyway and they just set him up to die. And so I think there could be something there, but it's hard to grade him as a receiver right now. And I don't know if that gets better this year. So I don't really know much about Texas Tech's QB situation, if it's changing at all, but that was kind of an issue. And then given his size, while I said he's generally a more creative player, he does still have that tendency to just bulldoze straight through the line and say, you know what, F it, lane's not open, I'm going to kill some guys. He does that a bit, but it's okay. You're drafting this guy to be that. And so getting into the summary here, he's a downhill runner with immense physicality that he uniquely combines with unexpected creativity. Actually, I forgot to say something. I want to note this really quick. One of the first plays I saw from Brooks and why he's a my guy is one of his first blocking reps. You see the S grade there. You wonder why he got that? He decleats an edge rusher on the first freaking block I watch. Just kills him. Sends the guy flying. When he moves as a blocker, it's like watching a tackle. Like he's doing the jumps that the tackles do, that lateral movement. He looks like a tackle when he's blocking. It's insane to watch this guy. I'm getting a little excited, so I'll calm down. I'll get back to the summary, but I just want to note that I forgot to say it. But this is a guy moves quickly, he accelerates at top speed, and has that change of direction ability to make defenders miss. When hitting defenders, he lowers his shoulder and he embraces contact, often leaving bodies in the dirt. He has unbelievable power and contact balance, emerging from piles he has no business escaping. Brooks shows some upside in the receiving game given his consistent hands, but many of his receptions went for negative yards, although I think this is a result of poor decision-making by the quarterback. As a blocker, Brooks is ferocious, moving like a lineman and fighting to the death with rushers. There were even times when Brooks managed to deplete edge rushers, going back to my excitement there. With all these exciting traits, he still has some limitations. He lacks that good top-end speed, which eliminates really any chance of being a home run threat. While he was a more creative guy than other power backs, he has the tendency to charge into defenders when a lane hasn't developed yet. There's a lot to be excited about with Brooks, as it's hard to imagine him being a bad pick. Brooks could be anything from the reliant, short yardage back to the dominant workhorse who stresses the physicality of defenses. It's simply your choice. So my pro comp here is like one of the first things I thought when I was watching was James Robinson. Now, even as someone who loved James Robinson, I don't know if he's like, S tier in physicality. So that's probably the big difference here. But talking about the actual comp, similar frames, Brooks being a little bit bigger than him. But both guys, were people who thrived on a really good mix of physicality and elusiveness. Both prospects were capable, but limited receivers and dominate in pass protection. And while they could both lower the shoulder, they can make defenders miss in space with subtle moves, quickness, but they ultimately lacked anything close to home run speed. One thing that kind of did it for me is like, I don't know if people remember this. I imagine they do. But like James Robinson's first game, he hurdles a guy in that. Brooks has that same kind of mentality where you just don't expect it from like a small, muscular player. But he goes and tries to hurdle a guy right off the bat. Like these are players that do not just win with physicality. They will like shock you with that elusiveness at times. And then once again, big difference, of course. While Robinson was physical, Brooks just takes it to a whole nother level. So that's the big difference here. He's the super muscular, jacked up, killer James Robinson, that version of him. So I gave him a late second round grade. I really like this player. One of my favorite guys in this class. And another one of my favorite guys is coming up here in a second as well. But late second, games I watched were Houston, Kansas State, and Texas. So getting to my other guy, And I've got more people I like, of course, but just maybe guys who aren't talked about as much that I have graded a little bit higher that I think would be really fun, really good at the next level. Nicholas Singleton out of Penn State. So this is, I think, the last person on this list that hasn't had like crazy production. And what we got to remember is, well, you want to see a guy produce. It's also nice if you can get a guy that maybe breaks out in the third year, doesn't have a ton of miles, and now he can come into the NFL and play for a longer amount of time. And I think Nicholas Singleton could be one of these guys. This is a freakish player. He has a prototypical build for a running back, and despite being built for power at 6 foot 227, he has phenomenal top end speed. There's talks about him potentially running in the 4.3s at the combine next year. He has heavy usage behind zone blocking schemes. That's what you're going to be looking for here specifically. He's a very patient runner. He has good lateral agility, gets downhill fast, and gets his shoulder down. Going back for a moment to his patience, this is an area where he improved last year. So there was some talks about maybe he wasn't as good because of ball carrier vision. He has gotten better. He's become a much more refined player there. He took a big step forward. Now he gets a little bit too patient at times. And so that's a bit of an issue. But with clear progression, I could see him taking another step there next year. And then maybe this is a guy with really good ball carrier vision and then phenomenal athletic and physical profiles. Getting into other positives here, though, he has great top end speed. He's a natural guy in the receiving game. He makes some difficult catches, and he makes really good decisions as a runner. Shows good vision. When he gets going in open field, he'll blow through contact. If you do not hit him well, he'll just run straight through you. It just doesn't even look like he touched him. He'll churn out those extra yards as well when he's going through contact, keeps his legs moving. And as a return man, he's got some value too. He was a guy who was able to bring him home for touchdowns. He is dangerous in open space. And while his blocking isn't up to standard and got a pretty poor grade from me, he's built to block. He's built to be able to succeed in that role. I saw film of him, and not really film, but more so like practice clips, where he's like training against Abdul Carter, which if you watch the last video, I'm a pretty big fan of Abdul Carter. So I think he's going to get better there. It's really kind of the last thing that limits him from being that all-around back, but he has every bit of potential to fix that problem. And then the final thing for positives, it's just worth noting that Penn State did not have great interior run blocking from what I saw on film. There were a lot of plays where he was just getting blown up. And then that kind of leads into me almost saying he's like too patient, but you also don't want to see him just get the tendency of, okay, I'm going to bounce it out outside every single time. And you got to keep in mind too, like his tackles, I don't know as much about Caden Wallace. He was actually the first guy drafted I did not have scouted. But like Olu Fashanu, that was the big thing he struggled with, was run blocking. So didn't have a great cast there last year, and might not as much this year too, but there's a lot here. Getting into concerns, he can clean his fumbles up. He had a couple drops as well in 2023. These are not like massive issues, but just things he needs to clean up. He can also be too patient at times. Like I said before, could also not be as big of a deal as I think. And he could also be a more creative runner. More creative with his ball carrier vision. He often just kind of waits in the middle for a lane to open. So want to see him, become more decisive. He's also, once again, not a good blocker. He's often out of position or just simply does not pick up a block. And then he doesn't have great contact balance when he gets hit low. So he definitely improve in these areas, but getting to my long summary on him, I said he's a freak athlete with immense upside as a running back. He has a prototypical build that somehow manages to sustain great speed and tremendous power. He's a patient runner, letting plays develop in front of him. And when he gets going, he moves quickly downhill and he gets his shoulder down for contact. He consistently makes good decisions, but does at times wait too long. When Singleton goes down, he'll keep his legs moving and consistently churn out extra yards. While he's not super elusive, he can shift around. He still has good lateral mobility. He has a natural ability as a receiver, and makes difficult hand catches and shows the potential to enter a larger role. As a blocker, he's often out of position, missing his guy and not making an impact, but that's a fixable issue. He has the strength to hold up against rushers if he can properly square up. So, like, film I watched, there was, I think, one play I saw specifically where he finally just got straight on a guy and stopped him right in his path. It was easy for him. So that's the big thing for him. He can clean up some inconsistencies as well, such as the couple of fumbles and couple of drops from the previous season, but these aren't glaring issues. He'll need to become a more decisive runner as well, but he was often in poor situations because Penn State wasn't dominating blocking on the interior. Everything is there for Singleton to be a good starting back, but even if he doesn't reach that potential this year, he's a good investment for a team with a strong supporting cast to help. So, getting in my comp here, I had Jonathan Taylor, another one that I searched for and saw some people talking about. They're very identical builds, and the main thing here is that freakish combination of speed and strength. These guys are built for heavy workloads. They're built to get the ball a lot. They can push the pile for extra yards. They're going to be dangerous as well in open space. And the difference is really here, it's an upside comp, right? Because if I'm not saying upside, I'm saying he's Jonathan Taylor. You take him in the first round. He's not that right now. You know, the big things here as far as differences, Taylor, he has better vision, and he is a better blocker. So, once again, things that Singleton can improve. But one thing that Singleton has over Jonathan Taylor is that receiving ability. So, big advantage there. And so, I could see Singleton being someone who has a great year if he can kind of overcome that situation, which given, Penn State's probably got some different players in there now. I don't know everything about their offensive line, but if he can outplay that, he can have a good season, he produces a lot, and hopefully gets a bigger role because he was kind of rotational a bit. I think he could be a top running back. I think he's right here with these guys, and I almost put him above the next guy we'll talk about because, I think he could be better. It's just it's the production, right? It's one guy's a proven commodity, the other one you got to prove a little bit. But late second round for Nicholas Singleton, I watched West Virginia, Michigan, and Ole Miss, all from the 2023 season. Now, getting to the guy that I end up putting above him that is really there because he's proven himself over and over, and someone I kind of hope I get to go watch this year because I'm not that far away from Kansas's campus. Devin Neal. So, Devin Neal here, he is really good at pretty much everything. He's got a good frame, fills it out well, he has great acceleration, good overall speed, and he has a very balanced usage of schemes, although maybe a little bit more in gap. And this is a guy who, man, when he changes directions, it looks like nobody else in this class. He will cut incredibly sudden. He is super quick with it. And this is a guy like that, those change of direction skills are so good that defenders will just go to the ground trying to keep up with him. So it's phenomenal. He'll make you miss in a phone booth. You hear that phrase again. Really great vision as well. Got an A from me. Not perfect, but really good vision. And is a guy that just consistently gets the most out of plays. And he runs with these little nuances. He's just, at every moment, he's getting the most he can out of it and being a very smart player. He was also in 2023 6th in yards per carry. So great statistic to be a part of there. And as a blocker, like, not incredible, but he's sound and he gives good effort. That's a really nice thing to have from running backs, given that most of them just aren't great blockers, or if they are, probably not starters. It's kind of rare you get these really good all-around backs. So Devin Neal, good enough there. Definitely fine with it. He has some route variance as well in the receiving game, and it's a guy who fights for contact for those extra yards. Didn't give him a super high physicality grade, but he gets the job done, and he very rarely is going to be putting the ball on the ground. Getting into concerns here, he doesn't really have that elite home run speed, but he's close. If he gets enough separation or maybe paired up with a strong safety or someone who's not as fast, he can get there. but it's just a little bit below. He's got a high level of production in college as well. So back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, going to have a little more wear and tear, some of these other prospects. It's also not much of an in-between the tackles rusher. He often looks to bounce outside, so it's where the ball carrier vision takes a small hit there. And then the power aspect of his game is kind of mostly average, maybe slightly above average. So getting into the summary for Devin Neal before we get into the top 5 guys that are the big names here. Neal is an elusive back with proven production to translate to the next level. He's run for 1,000 yards in back-to-back seasons due to his playmaking nature. He has great acceleration and borderline home run speed, an athletic baseline he only improves upon. He cuts unlike any other back in the class, changing direction instantly and often causing defenders to slip into the dirt. His combination of high-end ball carrier vision and elusiveness make him a major threat. What's also exciting about Neal is that he's an all-around back, having the chops for blocking and showing promise in the receiving game. He's proven to this point that he can handle being the workhorse of an offense. Neal lacks in a few areas such as high-end speed and the lack of dominant power in his game. He'll fight through contact, but he's not someone who's going to lay the boom like other prospects. Given his productive career, Neal has a lot of tread on the tires heading to the next level, which could be a consideration for NFL teams. Overall, if you're just looking to draft a plus starter at an affordable cost during the draft, Neal might be the perfect match. So getting into the comp here, I went with James Cook. This is a little bit looser of a comp, but the reason why, similar size, guys who have that like ridiculous change of direction ability. They also were both guys who had upside as receivers, but Cook, as you know, if you have him in fantasy football, a lot more refined of a receiver. Does great in that role. But I do think Neal could be good there and be better than that B- grade. They also both struggled with bouncing runs outside a lot. Did it way too often. But I do think overall that Neal does have better ball carrier vision. So that's the reason for that comp there. I gave Neal a late second round grade. I'd be completely fine if you took him in the middle of the second round, though. I think he's like borderline in this top group. But, you know, if you go for that third year of 1,000 yards, go set the record, I think, for rushing at Kansas, that's going to probably get you there. So, film reviewed for him, just to wrap him up, was Illinois, Texas, and Kansas State, all from the 2023 season. Now, getting into the big names that people are going to know if they've followed this class, and I think you probably know a few I've already talked about as well. But first guy I've got here reminds me of one of the first draft prospects I've ever really looked at that close. Ashton Jeanty. So, out of Boise State, to keep it simple with him to start off, he just is so good at using the limited physical gifts he has. Now, not athletic as much. Athletic, he's phenomenal. But for being a 5'9" back, and probably a bit shorter than that, probably more like 5'7", 5'8", he does a great job for it. He is super muscular. He's well built in that regard, just a smaller guy. So, strong build for a smaller back, super athletic as well. He has a lot of shiftiness, and you will find him hurdling people on the field. So, a lot of fun to watch for him. He has good high-end speed, and his speed can be kind of deceptive. You know, we are talking about 215-pound, 5'7", 5'8" running back, right? So, like, this weight is comparable to guys who are, like, kind of right where they need to be as far as size. So, keep that in mind. It's on a smaller frame. It's going to be a lot more compact. So, it's impressive to have this kind of speed, and he'll trick people in open field. He'll make them take poor angles. He's got good explosion. He can get through gaps quick. He makes defenders miss, and he's just phenomenal vision. I gave him a perfect grade there. He's consistently maximizing plays, making people miss in open field. He gets really creative with it. He'll string together moves. He's phenomenal. Simple way of putting it. But he just has a way of eluding defenders without giving up speed. He just manages to hold on to it. His heavy usage in the receiving game, he totaled over 500 yards in 2023. He has a very good route tree. He has 5 incompletions over 2 years, only being a drop back in 2022. So perfect grade as a receiver. Going back to the rushing elements, he'll power through contact in those one-on-one situations. He has phenomenal contact balance as well. He understands how the lineup hits. Really good about playing it out and doing it quick as well. He has an incredible understanding of leveraging his body. He absorbs hits well, maintains momentums. It's the best body control I can remember from anyone I've ever scouted. In his very limited time as well as a blocker, there's clear effort from him. Obviously, being very short, it's going to hurt him in that regard, but he's about as good as you can get there. And as far as his scheme, more of a guy for gap blocking. Now, getting into concerns, of course. I think he's shorter than the listed height. So it's something to note here. In addition to that, he doesn't have much ability to churn out yards without getting a push. So, I mean, he'll keep his feet moving, but he just doesn't have the size to be able to push the pile by himself. So he usually needs help. Doesn't have that power element on the inside, despite being 215. This is just an area where he lacks. He might not be that all-around, do-everything 3-down back. He's also barely used as a blocker. So that's a big question for him, given his size, given the lack of experience, even with effort. That's not just going to get you a great grade necessarily. He also had a bit of a fumbling issue in 2023. He had 5 on the season, second in all of college football. That's a bad stat. You don't want to be part of that. He needs to clean that up. And final thing I wrote, size could lead to injuries, right? Being a smaller back like this, he might not last that long. And that kind of goes into the comp, a guy who did not last that long, and Doug Martin. We'll get to him in a moment. But getting to the summary, this is a refined, smaller prospect that reminds me of the muscle hamster, Doug Martin, another great player from Boise State, which I didn't realize Martin was out of Boise State until I scouted Jeanty. But Jeanty has a muscular build with borderline elite athleticism given his shorter stature. He's a master of his craft, knowing how to use his body to his advantage with how he lines up hits or eludes defenders without losing momentum. He may have the best body control of any player I've ever scouted. His vision is among the best in this class, and he has a way of getting creative to maximize plays. He's a workhorse in the passing game. Had over 500 yards in 2023 and ran a really large route tree. Over his career, he's only had 5 incompletions and 1 drop in this massive role he's had. Given his build, there's some concerns that are pretty obvious. He appears to be noticeably shorter than his listed size, and we can see him sustain injuries if given a heavy workload. When running inside, he doesn't really have the power to push the pile when there's no rushing lane. As a blocker, he's limited in experience and he lacks the size to dominate in that area, no matter what the effort is. Arguably, the largest issue from last season was the fumbles, as he ranked second among all running backs. Once again, a statistic you do not want to be a part of. He has the upside to be a special player in the NFL, but I would be cautious about using him in a heavy workload. He could be the impact player of a committee backfield at the next level. So, pro comp here, it's Doug Martin, who actually went in the first round, and I think that Jeanty is better than what Martin was. These were guys, both Boise State alumni. They're short, muscular players. They're built to thrive on contact balance. They know how to elude, how to absorb hits. They both struggled, though, with fumbles in their college careers. But it should be noted that one area where Martin was stronger, and we'll see, of course, we got this whole year, and this was when Martin proved it. He cleaned up the fumbling issues his final year before he declared, and that was a big part in why he went as early as he did. One major difference as well, though, in Jeanty's favor, is that he has a larger and more refined presence in the receiving game. So that's an area where Martin lacked, and that's a lot of value that you're going to bring to a team. So a lot of good stuff to like there, but you just got to keep the size in mind, and it's unfortunately the thing that limits here. And you see that with a lot of positions, players you love that just don't have all the physical gifts they need to be able to do what they're good at. But my grade for him, still, early second-round guy. I watched Memphis, Colorado State, and UNLV, so not super strong opponents, but you can tell this is a player that is still going to be very good at the next level. So getting to our top 4 now, and getting to a player who is he's got some issues with injuries, and I know some people are not super high on him. There's some people who are still super high on him too, but it's TreVeyon Henderson. So he could have declared last year, might have even been able to declare the year before as well, but ended up not doing it. He's had a lot of injury issues since a really good 2021 season. I was not super high on him last season when I scouted, but I'll admit, like, my process was nowhere near as good. Not that it's perfect now, but it's a lot better than it was. I didn't watch a ton of these prospects, and I just probably didn't get a great game from Henderson. It could be that simple for a guy just not being high on my list, because bad first impression takes 40 later impressions to fix that, I think is the saying. So, Henderson, watching him again this year, coming into it fresh, he is a borderline first round guy. But he's also in a situation that's going to be really hard this year. And it's going to be really hard for the other guy in this too, who's next on our list, another Ohio State running back now. But getting into Henderson here, this is a player who has suddenness and decisiveness. His blazing fast speed, incredible top end speed. He will absolutely torch a defense. He was even at points just straight up used on the outside as a receiver. And he would end up passing everyone. He would be open, but they didn't have a good quarterback last year, unfortunately. So, other things about him though, he has that elite shiftiness to elude tackles in close quarters. He has a great job of attacking gaps as well. He gets into open field quick, so he's not in that zone where you don't want him to be, where players are close by and he can get hit there. He goes very quick through it. He's a nasty blocker as well. He will give great effort, and he holds up very well, which was really nice to see, given he's listed at 208. It's a little bit of a concern there. Going back to the route tree again, diversity. He has different plays there that he'll run. He's really good as a receiver. He has great ball security as well. His only fumble was back in 2021. It's been quite a while. He's got very good ball carrier vision. It's a guy who sets up his moves late as well, which makes him hard to anticipate. He's going to make this difficult for defenses. He constantly lowers his shoulder when he hits defenders, and as far as his scheme, more of a zone blocking guy. That's where he has his most experience, but I think he could also do fine in their schemes too. So, concerns, the big thing here, injuries have just derailed him in previous years. So, last 2 years has not started all season long. That has hurt him a lot as a prospect, and perhaps is part of the reason why Judkins is there now. I, of course, don't know all the reasoning, but he's not been on the field all the time. He's also a guy that, getting into the injuries a little bit here too, and what might be hurting him in a sense, he's built lean. And he kind of has a wide frame, was one thing I noticed. Like, he's not maybe as, it's not skinny, I want to say, but he's wider than most guys. So, there's a lot of surface area that you can hit. So, it's not a great thing for him. And it's a guy who can get rattled by physical defenders, too. I think I saw a play where, like, Mikey Sainristil, who's way smaller than he is, absolutely lit him up last year. So, power aspect of his game is lacking. That's the big thing here. He still plays physical. He tries to, but he's got to add on some muscle mass. And the good thing is, I saw a picture of him beside Judkins, and there's not a huge difference there. So maybe he has this year. And then the final thing, he's not really used that heavily as a receiver, but once again, he's done really well in that role in his time, which is why he still gets a good grade. Getting into the summary here, he's a decisive runner with blistering fast speed. He has a shiftiness to make people miss in a phone booth. Henderson is an aggressive runner, attacking gaps and blowing through in minimal time, causing defenders to miss time tackles. What's impressive is how often Henderson makes the right choice given his processing speed, which is a major advantage over most other backs in the class. When finishing runs, Henderson consistently lowers his shoulder, gaining as much yardage as possible. As a receiver, Henderson shows immense upside and a diverse route tree, but he lacks much playing time in that role. Given his speed, he's tasked at times with threatening the top of the defense and has been successful. Henderson is a nasty blocker, giving high level effort and holding up defenders consistently. He's also someone coaches will trust protecting the ball, as he hasn't fumbled since 2021. Injuries have been the primary factor in Henderson's career being slowed, and this year is about proving he's past them. I'd like to see him bulk up another 10 pounds to help mitigate these issues and supplement the power aspect of his game, an area where he lacks. If he can answer the questions surrounding these issues, he could come into the draft as a potential first round pick. So my pro comp for him, I went with Tahj Spears. These are both guys, very similar play styles. I do think Henderson's a little bit bigger than Spears, but they're both super fast, decisive runners. They make defenders miss with their short area explosion, that late decision making that's still usually good. They have adequate to good receiving ability and blocking abilities as well. But ultimately, the big issue for both of them kind of struggle in the power aspect of the game. So that's my comp for him, was Tahj Spears. It's an early second round grade still to me. I just think that this is a guy who can be special in the NFL, and to spend a second round pick isn't a huge deal. He'd be good to go to one of those teams maybe picking earlier that wants a dynamic threat on the offense, and you go get Henderson to do that for you. My film reviewed for Henderson to wrap this up was Notre Dame, Minnesota, and Michigan, which I believe were all from the 2023 season. So that's it for Henderson. We got 3 more guys here. We're going to go through our other Ohio State back. It was with Ole Miss last year, and then we got 2 first rounders. So Quinshon Judkins. It's my last of the day 2 guys here. He's got ideal size for the position, just straight up ideal size. You could technically say, hey, he could be a slightly bigger, but not really a big deal. All right, really great size here. He got over 75% of his yards after contact. Good numbers there. He's a tough player who's going to fight through contact for extra yards. He plays with tempo. He does a good job waiting for blocks to develop. He's just very smart. It's shown in his moments on the field where he's deciding like how he's going to elude people. His processing speed. For example, there was a play where a guy tried to force him to fumble the ball. He's trying to get it out. Judkins immediately after seeing that goes into a spin move because the guy can't get his hands on him like that, and he gets away and he gets a bunch of yards. So stuff you love to see. He's a smart player, and he's got a great build, and he's a pretty good athlete too. He's got great burst and explosion to elude tackles, and his yards per attempt, the reason why it was low was mainly because of poor offensive line play. And now you're going to a team that is pretty good offensive line. We're going to be talking about a few guys from there as draft prospects. We've already talked about them on here, and Josh Simmons and Donovan Jackson, maybe some other guys too. I'm not 100% sure on the rest of them, but that's the school that usually has pretty good offensive linemen and good play there. So that'll definitely be helpful for him with the transition. He's also a guy who is not afraid to take on big hits as a blocker. He'll lay his body out. He has good contact balance. He's a guy who hasn't fumbled to 2022. And finally, good balance of zone and gap experience, so you're not worrying too much about what scheme you run. He should be able to do it. Now, concerns with him, I said that he doesn't really have a large workload in the receiving game, although he seems capable. So you want to see him get proven there a little bit more, although I think that Henderson's probably more the receiving guy. He also lacks that top-end speed to break away from defenses, which is what limits his athleticism score here. At times, he'll just kind of try to plow up the middle instead of bouncing outside when there's no lane. So that's not always great. Not a huge issue, though. Like I still gave him an A+ on ball carrier vision because everything else is really good there. It's a minor issue. As a blocker, why he doesn't really get much above average, well, he's willing to put himself out there. He will sometimes get destroyed. He can get bulldozed. So you got to be good at it too. So that's an area where he's got to grow. And the final thing I said, given he's mostly average as a blocker and receiver, I'm not sure that he's the ideal all-around running back. So He's got something to prove there, I think, to avoid being a part of a committee. That's one of the reasons why he just has that early second round grade. Maybe doesn't sneak into the first. Realistically, based on where things are right now, he's probably a first round guy. That would be the fair expectation. But my summary on him, I say he's a smart, tough player heading to a great situation in 2024. Despite playing behind an outmatched offensive line, he consistently made positive plays, using tempo to extend his runs. Here in most of his yards after contact, showing his toughness and contact balance. On these runs, he could flash moments of brilliance, such as utilizing a spin move to avoid a forced fumble and break into the open field. He can be a nightmare to tackle even in the closest of encounters. He profiles primarily as a workhorse back and has something to prove in the other aspects of his game. He hasn't been a huge part of a receiving game, although he appears capable, and he's had some rough moments as a blocker. In addition, Judkins doesn't have the blazing top speed to break away from a defense and score. While I think he would be adequate as an all-around back, it would be hard to imagine teams not opting for a committee approach to keep him fresh and to get more upside in those other areas. With that said, I think he's a capable back who has the potential to break out in an improved situation this year. My comp for him, I went with Rashad Penny, kind of a looser comp here, but guys that had similar builds. They had a game that thrived on patience. They ran with tempo. They set up blockers. They're both guys who had the strength to break tackles, though, too. Specifically, ones that weren't, high quality attempts, maybe, but they had good contact balance in general. They're also both guys that kind of had concerns about being all-around backs because the receiving and blocking parts of their game needed a bit of work. The one difference I will say, though, because Judkins is an early second-round guy, and while Rashad Penny was a player that was looked at really highly when he came out, I do think Judkins is a little bit better. He's a little more explosive of a player than what Penny was. So, grade here, early second, once again. I watched LSU, Georgia, and Penn State for his film, so all really good teams. He's going up against good defensive lines, too. So, played against some hard teams. Like, impressive stuff. I will say, if I had to rank Henderson and Judkins, not considering injuries, I might actually put Henderson into third. But that is a part of this that matters, because Judkins is the one who's been healthy. He's the one who's been on the field all the time. That's going to be important for the evaluation. But I'm projecting Henderson higher because I think he's going to be able to respond well this year. Now we got two more guys. We got two first-round players, and my second guy here, I really wanted to put him first overall. It came down to ball carrier vision because I felt like the top guy here was just he was better straight up. And Hampton, my second guy here, getting into him, he's so good at so many things, but he's just got to make better decisions as a ball carrier. That's the main area where he needs to improve, but there's so much potential with him, and I think he can enter the draft as the top guy. Getting into positives here, I mean, you're going to see there's going to be a lot of them. Look at all the blue chip grades on the right, but ideal size. He led the country in yards after contact. He plays with a ton of power, and he has really good top end speed to be a home run threat. He's another one of these great combinations of speed and power as a player. He shows really good contact balance on film, and when he's fighting people, he fights to the death. Most players would go down earlier. He does not. He stays up. He extends plays. He busts his ass in those regards. He has been reliable as well in the receiving game. He's had no drops throughout his entire career. And as a blocker, he has phenomenal play. He is a great asset in that regard. He gets squared up with defenders, and he will hold his own. He also doesn't get demoralized after a bad play. This impressive trait was shown to me when I watched him play Clemson, which it's bad to fumble twice, right? We're going to talk about that in a moment. But the fact that he was able to just come back every single time that he turned over the ball and immediately have like a 50-yard run and break the defense, and had, like, I think the most yards he had all season, I'm pretty sure, against Clemson, are really high on that list. In that moment says a lot. Because you don't want running backs going out there that fumble once and then they're just broken. And they fumble it every time and they're like Melvin Gordon now. You don't want that. And so this guy has a great mentality to how he's approaching the game. Final note here is a positive. Lots of experience behind zone blocking schemes. Now, I do want to actually throw out something else here I heard. So not original story or something that only I know of, but when he was weightlifting in high school, the school he went to had a limit on the bar of about 500 pounds. And Hampton, it was so talented and so physically gifted, he was able to go over 500. And when he was lifting, the bar was literally bending as he went. He could not get to his maximum amount because they didn't have a bar at his school that would work, that would even hold up. It would literally snap if they put on more. That's the kind of power profile we're talking about with Omarion Hampton, and you see it on film when you watch him. There's so exciting of traits with him, and the athleticism's there, right? It's like part of the reason why we get this comp, which is, yeah, it's an upside comp. I want to make that clear. He's not going second overall, but just want to say those things about him. Concerns. The big thing, once again, is the ball carrier vision. It's not on par with the top prospects of the class. And that's what happens when you're so imposing to other players. You're so much better athletically and physically that you often just, you don't really have to be that creative, right? You just run up the middle, bulldoze people, and get into the end zone. So he kind of lacks in that regard because he doesn't have to be challenged as much. In the NFL, that'll change. So that's an issue. I think he can get better, though. That's the big thing I want to see this year. And if he does that, he's RB1 for me. I'm not sure that he wouldn't be RB1, because if you're getting that ball carrier vision up, what's he bad at? You know, worst grade is like as a receiver, and it's still really good. So, you know, it's mostly there because he doesn't have a huge role. But other things to him, doesn't have a ton of suddenness to his game. He often just goes for it as well rather than letting the play develop. So back to ball carrier vision for a moment. Once again, could take a step forward as a receiver, enter a larger role. He's capable. But we got to see that. And then the final thing here, the fumbles, right? You got to clean that up. He had multiple in each of the past 2 seasons. So protect the ball. Prove this year that you can make better decisions and you're going to be more creative as a ball carrier, and you're not going to turn it over to the defense, which, you know, Nate Wiggins made it pretty hard for him. But yeah, a lot of things to love about Omarion Hampton. I'll get into the summary now. He's a physically imposing back who churns out extra yards better than anyone in the country. He plays with immense power and has sneaky speed, which doubles as a home run threat. While many backs go down shortly after contact, Hampton battles to the death with defenders, pushing piles and falling forward for extra yards. While he isn't a well-developed receiver, he's been very reliable with 0 drops in his career, despite some tough throws being sent his way. He brings his best as a blocker, squaring up with blitzers and stopping them in their tracks. The upside of being an all-around back is there, but there are some notable concerns he'll need to address. It seems as if Hampton doesn't wait for plays to develop, opting to sprint forward and looking for the gap. And not looking for the gap, that is. The sense in him sometimes hitting his linemen, or just missing better rushing lanes altogether. Fumbling issues also came to head against Clemson in 2023, both taking place deep in Clemson's territory and resulting in lost points. One of them was actually at the 1-yard line, which was really unfortunate. But while that's an issue, I was incredibly impressed to see how he bounced back, getting creative, having some big runs that shredded the Clemson defense. Hampton is not far away from being a rising star at the next level, but he needs to clean up some issues that could severely limit a sky-high ceiling. So, talk about the comp for a second. There's actually a video on YouTube you can go watch where it has Omarion Hampton on it, and it just says the Saquon Barkley of high school football. And looking at the comp, there's things here that make sense. Now, Do I think he'll be as good as what Saquon Barkley was supposed to be? Right? Because we're mostly comparing to what prospects were coming out, which Barkley was like almost generational as a player. I think he could get close. I don't know if he's to that level. He needs to have a pretty damn good year to do that, right? But it's a hell of a player. Similar builds for these guys built with a bruising mentality, but it's an upside comp. Both players, it's about physicality for them. They're huge competitors. They dominated in yards after contact, but they were both kind of limited because of vision issues. Barkley's maybe not as big, but they didn't have to, but they chose to rely on their physical gifts too often. And I'd put Hampton in general a little bit below Barkley in most things as a prospect, but it is important to note that while we're comparing this to what Barkley was supposed to be, that pick, while Barkley's a really good player, probably didn't pan out that well, right? They placed a franchise tag on him, got one more year, and he went to the Eagles. And he's not really been worth a second overall pick in the first place. Really good player, should have been kept by the Giants, absolutely. That was stupid to let him go. But I think like what Barkley was supposed to be, he hasn't really reached that, right? Because if he did, there'd be no discussion about keeping him. Not that he shouldn't have been kept. But that's what I had for Hampton. He is a late first for me right now. If he figures out the ball carrier vision, middle of the first. It might even be like early to middle of the first at the end of this. We'll just have to see how good he can get. But this is a guy that probably has his floor around here, if not maybe a B plus. But he's going to be a top back in this class as long as he declares, and he should be. He's going to be 22 years old at the time of the draft. The film I watched for him: Appalachian State, Miami, Florida, and Clemson, all from the 2023 season. Now, getting into the final guy here and finally wrapping up our 15 prospects, we've got Ollie Gordon II. So this is a young player. He's going to turn 21 before the draft. He's got a very tall frame, 6'2", 215. Just those numbers actually don't look that great, right? When you don't see a picture of him, it's like, well, he's a little too lengthy, and he has, slightly below average size as far as weight. But you see pictures of him, this guy is shredded. Every ounce of it is muscle. And I think for that 6'2", he plays pretty freaking well with it. But he's got a huge frame. It's practically all muscle mass. He gallops in open space. He covers a lot of field quickly. He has the high-end speed as well to break open a defense, and he will finish those plays. Where he is the strongest is his decision-making. Phenomenal in that regard. He has great ball carrier vision. He consistently chooses the best lanes available and creates something out of nothing. He can power through tackles. He can drag the pile. And he is really good at absorbing hits. He has the contact balance to survive multiple hits, and he can still break away on those plays. And speaking of breakaways, led the entire country in breakaway yards. He'll often get his head down as well, put the shoulder into someone at contact, and he'll fall forward for extra yards. Nice little thing to see there. And he has an iconic spin move. You just saw it if you watched the College Football 25 gameplay video. One of the iconic moments in this, but he has a really good spin move. He can use that to avoid defenders in space. It's his thing. And he knows how to get skinny between defenders. I think he does great getting through gaps. He had a good usage in the receiving game as well. And he's pretty nasty as a blocker. He'll put guys in the dirt if they aren't careful. Now, a little bit of an issue there with him as a blocker. Sometimes he'll kind of like lunge at people too early. He'll get too low, and if someone can catch it, they just jump over him. He doesn't really do a whole lot to stop them, so he's got to clean up blocking a bit. His form isn't the greatest, but he's absolutely willing in that regard. Also heard some really good things about him as a teammate, and how he motivates players around him. That's one thing with Ollie Gordon you're going to like. But getting into concerns, being, 6'2", he's got a lot of surface area for defenders to grab at. He also lacks that ideal burst, and he kind of needs a runway to reach that top speed. He won't make you miss in a phone booth. And for how big he is, I think he can lay the boom a bit more. That's kind of where like the Derrick Henry talk with him stops, because he just doesn't have that same level of physicality. Derrick Henry is Derrick Henry. The builds are kind of similar in some ways. I think he'd have to be a bit bigger, but tall, muscular backs, right? He can also be a bit indecisive at times, but kind of a minor issue. And he has some shiftiness, but it's not an overwhelming thing. His athleticism is limited. And just a funny note here, do not let this guy throw the ball. Do not do it. I saw one play where he threw the ball and he just chucked it straight to a defender. Don't let him do it. Don't let him in on trick plays unless he's the guy catching it. That's the only thing he can do. So don't let that happen. He can time out his blocks better once again. Gets a little bit earlier, especially with the chop blocks. He'll lunge at guys. And then he had a couple fumbles in 2023, so got to clean that up. It's a little bit of an issue. But, seeing Melvin Gordon at the bottom, that's kind of horrifying. Speaking of fumbles. But getting into the summary, this is a bulked up, lengthy running back that thrives on consistently great decision making. He's patient, often choosing the right place to be, and has the high-end contact balance to survive hits. As a result, Gordon ranked first in breakaway yards during the 2023 season. Given his length, Gordon covers space quickly when he's up to full speed and can win against pursuit. He also has an iconic spin move he'll use in space and understands how to set up defenders, causing them to take poor angles because of his tempo. Gordon is a complete prospect, having ample time in the receiving game and consistently doing his job as a blocker. Concerns are relatively minor for Gordon and come with the type of player he is. He provides ample surface area for defenders to target, and he doesn't have the suddenness to make defenders miss in a phone booth. While he has the build to be physical, it's a trait that flashes more than dominates his game. Finally, Gordon can be a tad indecisive at times and get stuffed in the backfield, but more times than not, it's a result of great defensive play. If Gordon can get behind a competent offensive line at the NFL level, it'll only be a matter of time before he's a dominant player and a household name. So my pro comp for him was Melvin Gordon. So reason for this comp, both super lengthy guys, tons of muscle mass, and they covered ground really quick in open space, just galloping basically. They're both guys who often resort to a spin move, and they had really good contact balance when they were getting hit. And I think that, Melvin Gordon wasn't perfect at ball protection. He doesn't have, let me rephrase this, because they both got the last name Gordon. It got me confused here. Well, Gordon the second, so Ollie, isn't perfect at ball protection. He doesn't have nearly the same problems that Melvin had in college and the NFL. So that's your big difference there. I think he could be Melvin Gordon without the fumbling and just really good decision maker. I feel like he's a guy that just constantly gets the most of what he can. And that's what's important about putting him in a good situation. If you're one of these playoff teams and you don't have a good run game, but you've got a good offensive line, so this is the guy for you. Like, just go put in the pick on him. You're not going to regret it, because he's going to be a hell of a player for you. I watched 4 games for Ollie Gordon, and most guys, obviously, I watched 3, but I wanted to make sure that for everyone this year, when I summer scouted, it's my first year doing it, and coming off a year where I didn't really spend enough time on each prospect, I wanted to make sure I understood the player fully. And didn't feel like I did with Gordon at first, so I ended up watching 4 games. Felt like I got it at the end, and this is where I landed on him. He's a really good football player, top of the list, but like I said before, Hampton is not far behind, and if he can figure out the ball carrier vision and make up ground there, he's going to be my top guy, and I think he's going to be at least middle of the first round as far as how good of a player he is. So, hey, that's what we've got. 15 prospects. It took a long time. Probably, it appears almost 2 hours into this from what I can see. But, hey, this is a strength in this class. We got a lot of players we could talk about there. Next video might be the same too. I do not have my defensive tackles listed. I am recording this a few hours after I finished this group. I wanted to give you guys the best thoughts while things were fresh. So I would guess with defensive tackles, we'll probably get to like 15 guys again, so it'll be a longer video, but it'll be a fun group too. So saving some of the best positions for last as far as the talent, and I know there's going to be some fun players to talk about there. We'll hit quarterbacks after, not that's relevant to the Jaguars, but I think it's nice to know where guys might be going. And spoiler alert, this is the class that has a lot of guys who got to prove something. You know, not a lot of first round guys other than maybe Carson Beck, but we'll go through that and then we'll hit all the guys we missed. Right now, I think I've got 13 or 14 on that list, so that'll be another long video, and we'll be done with summer scouting. So appreciate y'all watching. Give me your thoughts on these players. I feel like the top of this class, you could have a lot of different guys as number one. If you're okay with the size with Jeanty, you put him number one. You know, if you love the decision making from Judkins and the build and what he does as a player, he could be number one too. Henderson has the potential. Hampton absolutely has the potential, and Gordon is probably just the most complete player at this point. So I totally get it. Let me know who you like, your thoughts on it. Would love to hear it. But thanks for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.